IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we discuss the story of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners.
Hey guys, welcome to an all new episode of the Musafir Stories. Before we begin, a special thanks to Nandita, Tarun, and Bahistar. Thank you guys for your feedback, it's much appreciated. As for today's episode, we have a very interesting and a special guest, an Australian academic and a clean energy enthusiast, Charles Worringham, who shares his learning from his journey across India. You could also check out Charles' work at www.indiapowerreview.com, where Charles is tracking some of India's energy transition statistics. Well, let's listen on.
So, with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Charles Worringham, an academic from Australia who was recently on a trip visiting India. Charles, thank you so much for being a part of the Musafir Stories and welcome to the podcast.
Hi Charles, welcome to the Musafir Stories.
My great pleasure, Saif and Faiza.
Yeah.
Thank you and kudos, Charles. You got the pronunciations right at the first go.
Yes.
So, Charles, the introduction that we gave about you is pretty concise. So, why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners what you do and how you ended up in India?
Yes, sure. Well, I'm a retired academic and I grew up in the UK and spent about a third of my life over there. And then when I was a young man, I went across to the States for my higher education for postgraduate. And I went and met my wife there, and we had 15 very interesting years in the States. And I had the opportunity to go to Australia and on a sabbatical for 1 year to a university in Queensland, and really, really enjoyed it. And we had younger children at that time. We thought, boy, we have to come back here. This is a super place. So we did. We moved out here and became citizens and have been in Australia ever since. So I retired recently, and obviously, when you go through that sort of a change in your life, you look for things to do. And I travelled as a young man. I'd done things like the old Interrail experience that many young Europeans used to do back in the 1970s, travelling around Europe by train all over the place in the summertime. And also, my wife and I had done a big bike trip around Europe when we first got married. So I think the travel bug had sort of bitten at an early stage. And when you give up your full-time work, there's an opportunity to pick it up again.
How did this travel bug for India arise, that too after you retired, right?
Yes, well, it had been on the boil for a couple of years, actually, before I retired, because one of the things that I had become really quite interested in was some of the issues that we, in our country, and you and yours, and in fact around the world, are facing in terms of some of the big challenges, energy and environment. You know, I think these are things that are really important everywhere, in different ways, of course. And I'd had the interesting experience of running for federal and state parliaments in Australia for the party called the Greens, which is an environmental party, so very strong on environmental policy. And I'm no longer doing that. But when I was the spokesperson for our state party in our 2015 state election, we had a lot of issues coming up about India because there's a plan to develop a huge new coal mine in Queensland with the goal of actually exporting to Asia and India in particular. And in fact, one of your big industrialists, Mr. Gautam Adani, is the proponent of that. And that had become quite a controversial issue here in our own political debate. And I was opposed to it, as indeed many people in Australia are opposed to it. We think that the days of burning coal to make electricity really should be in the past, not in the future. So, but many of the questions that we had from our political opponents and from journalists was about issues like, well, what about energy poverty? What about those places which use our coal or could use our coal to make electricity and bring people out of extreme poverty? And I thought, well, you know, that's a serious point. That's a really important issue. I know a little bit about this. But after the election was finished, I noticed a gentleman in Mumbai write a piece in the Guardian international newspaper, a guy called Debbie Goenka, who lives there. He's an environmentalist in Mumbai. And he wrote, if Australian politicians are really so concerned about energy poverty in India, maybe they should come over here and take a look for themselves. And I thought, that's a great challenge, actually. Even though I'm not active politically in that way anymore, it's a really important issue. I'd like to learn more about it so that I can help inform some of my fellow Australians about it. And so consequently, what I did was to do a lot of cold calling, really, to make contact with a number of groups and individuals who'd never heard of me, and arranged to go for a month around the country by train and meet a lot of people and just really learn. That's the bottom line. Understand what the nature of the problems really are.
Okay.
So that's how it got going.
Cool. And so this is not a business trip or a work trip, right? You were here to learn a little bit more about the energy situation in India, if I may, right?
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. So not for work, because my academic area was a completely different area. I actually studied and did research in movement disorders like Parkinson's disease and other things, nothing to do with this. But I think, if you're an educated person these days and you've had the opportunity to read, what's going on in the world, you can't really fail to be concerned about some of these big challenges, and I'd found them to be really interesting. And you think the reason why I think I got really interested in India as well is because this is an enormously important period of development for the country. You've got a huge population, still growing. You've got, a major way down the roadway towards an economy that is big, important, influential, linked to the rest of the world. So it's whatever happens in India doesn't just affect India. It affects all of us. And I think it's really important that those of us in other countries sit up and take note.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great thought to hit it off with, because a lot of us are busy with our own lives, just looking at it through our narrow blinkers, right? We don't really look outside of our purview or whatever is, say, impacting the bigger populace in general, right? But as a trip in general, right, a 1 month trip, especially to a country like India, and given the fact that it's the first time that you visited India, right, how was the planning for this whole trip? How was that? It's I'm sure it's a whole different animal in itself, right?
Yes, in a way. Well, except that I have to say, you're young people, so you wouldn't remember this time, but there was actually a period before an internet. And in those days, planning trips was a very different ballgame. You had to go to the library and dig out materials there, long periods of correspondence and letters and so forth. Much, much harder. So actually, of course, it is a great deal easier now to get information quickly, and that was certainly helpful. But one of the things that when you have the great good fortune to retire is you can spend a bit of time doing your homework. Now, I did a lot of reading. I went down to the local library and got a lot of books and bought a few and got a few online. And there's some really wonderful and interesting books about modern India that I really, really enjoyed and learned a great deal from, which I think helped me to know what to expect and what to look for as well. I'm thinking of some books by, for example, one of the non-resident Indians based in the US, Anand Giridharidas, who wrote a book in 2011, India Calling, which is a great story about the unfolding of modern India. A very bleak book, but I think incredibly insightful, Harsh Mandar's Looking Away, which is he wrote in 2015, which tells you really a lot about some of the social issues in the country. And in fact, I think some people who are based overseas have a different sort of perspective on visiting any country. So a couple of foreigners, Edward Luce has a lovely book called In Spite of the Gods, The Strange Rise of Modern India. Or William Dalrymple, the Brit, who's now virtually Indian if he's not actually Indian, and his City of Jinns about Delhi, and written his first book, and many others subsequently. So I really immersed myself in some reading to try to understand it a little bit, and then it was really a matter of getting on with the logistics. And there's an outfit in London, SD Enterprises, who will be known to many people who have traveled by train in India, and they specialize in making Indian train bookings for foreign visitors.
Okay.
So I used their services, and they had at that time, unfortunately this year, India Rail has just given this up, but they had a rail pass that you could buy that was reasonably inexpensive and allowed you to book tickets, but also at the drop of a hat, you could use that pass to get bookings, spontaneously. So that seemed like a fantastic opportunity, and that's what I organized. So I sort of sketched out a bit of a route and some visits and really went from there.
It's great. It's great that now you've gotten set with the planning part of it, with the logistics part of it as well. In terms of the rough route, right, of your whole India trip, why don't you just call that out? Like, where did you head off from? Where did it end? And we'll get into the specifics later. But just as a route,
Sure.
If you could just give us a brief outline.
Yes, of course. Well, actually, one of the great advantages in a way of being completely new to a country is that in one way, a particular route is as good as any other. You really don't know any better, so you can just go for it and plan a route and see how it goes. So I started out in Delhi. There were some people I did want to see there, and it seemed a logical starting point. And I made my way very quickly. I think it was the second or third day, actually, just a short trip to Uttar Pradesh via Lucknow to a little town of Unnao, because there's an opportunity to see a particular energy project there, and that was really fascinating. And then I went back to Delhi, had a little time there, took the overnight train to Ahmedabad. Unfortunately, got a bit sick there, so I didn't do too much, but I saw quite a bit of the old city, which is quite fascinating. And then down to Mumbai, across to Pune, Hyderabad next. And then I made my way down to Bangalore, and I was going to visit Coimbatore, but just at the time I was there, and this was late 2016, the Mrs. Jayalalitha, I think it is, the former chief minister of Tamil Nadu, died. And there was a little bit of concern on the news about how the trains were going to go in terms of crossing the border from Karnataka to Tamil Nadu. So I thought, well, I need to make my flight in Kochi, so I actually took a flight on that last leg. But I have to say, since I was traveling at that time, one rather interesting aspect of it for a foreigner arriving was that I landed in Delhi 2 days after demonetization.
Oh my God.
And that made for an interesting experience because when I went to the travel agent or the bank here in Australia to get some rupees, they just got wind of this, of course, and all they had were the notes which had just been taken out of circulation. So,
oh my God! Did they leave you shortchanged? Like, did they?
I had rather little cash coming in, and when I arrived at Indira Gandhi Airport, the first job was to go straight to the nearest ATM inside the airport and try and stock up. But I couldn't get too much, so that made for an interesting first week or two. I have to say, though, nothing like some of the challenges that obviously some folks particularly out in the country, were facing. It was very evident, yeah.
Yeah, it was. Let's just say that it took all of us by shock. I think those, especially those 2 or 3 weeks right after demonetization, it was a completely different experience. But yeah, so another thing I just wanted to ask before we delve into the details was, so this was a solo trip completely?
That's right. Yes. My wife would have come with me, but I think she finds the subject of energy transition not exactly to her taste, so she was kind enough to let me go on my own on this one. But I do have every intention of making sure that we do travel in India together, and I will be planning a trip to Kerala at some stage.
Very nice. Yeah, you should definitely come back. And also, just because you're doing this solo and, as you said, it was your first time in India as well, right? Any preconceived notions or any, how do I say, I mean, it's not fear per se, but did you have any nervousness while you were signing up for this?
I really can't say that I did. I think in a way, everyone experiences some form of culture shock, I suppose, in different guises when you travel to a different country and different culture for a short while. I had remarkably little. To be honest, I think having done a lot of reading, I think I knew a little bit about what I might be experiencing. And I think that's a really important thing. In fact, I'd really recommend that for all of your listeners who are planning trips. If you have the opportunity to sit down and do a little bit of homework, you're going to get much more out of your travel. It's not that you can replace your trip with reading. That never is going to be a substitute, but it can help you, I think, appreciate some of the, and have better expectations and appreciate what you're seeing a little more deeply.
Yeah, I think that's very, very useful advice and something we personally recommend as well, and we do it ourselves too. It would be a foreign country, for example. Just when you're visiting a new place, I think just looking up about the place, sometimes about the history or the culture, and even types of commerce, for example, about that place, right? it lays out the context so much better. And it also feels sometimes that you're able to connect the dots better. So that's what we feel personally, and we highly recommend that. And I think it's a great thing that you did that too, and especially while visiting India for the first time. I'm sure you were able to derive a lot out of this than otherwise. I mean, sure, the experiences are great when there's that element of surprise, but you also run the risk of missing out on a lot of things if you don't quite know what to expect and what to look for, right? So it's great to hear that. Now, talk to us a little bit more about your time in Delhi. How was your time in Delhi? I know post-demonetization would have been an experience in itself, but how about the place?
Yes, I was not on the regular tourist route. So for this particular trip, I could leave the Red Fort and other places behind, knowing I could come back and see them as a more regular tourist at some point down the track. So I made my first task to understand how to use the metro and get around and actually see different parts of Delhi. I had a few meetings that made that very, very helpful. And I was very impressed. I think the metro is a pretty amazing thing, actually. We have some big transport challenges in our big cities in Australia. And frankly, I think, that's an enormous investment. It's been a big and difficult thing to create. But can you imagine Delhi today without the metro? It would be incredible. Yeah, so that was my job one. I became a bit of an expert on the yellow line and some of the stops along the way. So that was very helpful.
It's very impressive, right, the way Delhi's connected, because even Faiz and I were there, I think 2 or 3 years ago. So I think today it's more developed, but even back in the day, a lot of our transport, getting from place to place was covered by using the metro. And I think it was one of the first metro lines in India also to start off. So that way they've done a great job. And as I was looking up on a few things about the Delhi metro, apparently it's about 2.5 million people that it ferries or 2.5 million riders that it carries each day. So I think that's very impressive just by sheer numbers.
It certainly is. The numbers are particularly impressive to Australians because that's about a tenth of the Australian national population travelling on the Delhi metro every day. And the number of people travelling on the Indian train system is the same as the Australian population every day. So those are big numbers.
Brilliant. I'm sorry I didn't interject, but tell me more. So once you had figured out the metro, what was your plan for Delhi, given that you were not looking at the touristic?
I had a couple of meetings and I spoke. First of all, I have to pay tribute to my host at my bed and breakfast place down in South Delhi, Sanjeev, a really wonderful man who is extremely hospitable and very, very helpful in getting a newcomer a little bit oriented. He's lovely guy. And anyway, so I went to have a couple of meetings, one of which was up in northern part of Delhi, which proved to be quite difficult to find the place. I had to actually have 2 goes to really find the location of this particular office. A group that looks at issues to do with India's rivers, waterways, water, dams, hydroelectricity, those sorts of things. A very interesting gentleman, Himanshu Thakkar, who periodically appears in the Indian media commenting on some of those issues. And not much directly to do with energy, you wouldn't think, but of course hydroelectricity is pretty big in India. And one of the concerns, obviously, is that there's always a trade-off. You can create energy if you dam a river, but what happens to the river? And there's a lot of issues around that. So he was very informative, very interesting about that. So I went to meet with him. I met with a chap who's an expert on energy issues at Brookings, India, which is in sort of West Delhi. That was fascinating. A lot of good data and a lot of research, which that particular group does. So I started to get more information about the subject matter of my visit in a way in Delhi.
They're basically a policy think tank, right?
That's right. A policy think tank, and they focus on a number of these issues related to economic development, broadly speaking.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of work until now, but anything outside of work that you indulged in, or what about the food also? Like, how's your tryst with Indian food? Because
I sampled everything I could.
You did? Okay.
Fortunately, the bed and breakfast gave us a fantastic breakfast every morning, so that really helped get things going. But I just was fairly eclectic, really. So I must admit I was probably a little bit cautious about street food to begin with until I knew a little bit more, but I soon figured out that places that have a lot of customers and it's good and hot you're not going to have any problems there, even if you have a delicate tummy. So I soon found that was terrific.
Okay.
So I just tried some different places, and I must admit I'm a bit of an inveterate coffee drinker, so I did have to find a few of your coffee joints in various spots around town.
Brilliant. So that's good, and I think that's a good first rule to go by, that try anything that's hot and the place looks relatively clean. I think that's a good first rule to go by, and it's great.
And popular. If people go back, it's obviously pretty good.
Yeah, but it's great that you did not become a victim of Delhi belly, right, as we call it.
Not at all. No problems the whole trip, actually. Well, that's nothing like that
because
at all.
traveler's diarrhea, or Delhi belly as we, as a slang we call it, right? I think a lot of people do go down with it, especially given the difference in how spicy the food can be or how different it can be. Right? A lot of people do face it, but it's great that you're not bogged down by anything like that. So what did you have planned next while you were in Delhi?
Well, actually, probably during that period, because I was only there for a few days before heading off, was that trip out to Uttar Pradesh, if I can tell you a little bit about that, because that was quite fascinating. I had the opportunity just at the last moment, a gentleman, Simran Grover, from Boond Energy, which is a small social enterprise. They do quite a few solar microgrids in particularly Rajasthan and the UP. And they said, do come along and have a look at one of our installations. So that's why I headed out to the town of Unnao, and which is just northeast of Kanpur, so just a little bit east of the Ganges there. And they were very hospitable and took me out for a day to a very small, already a hamlet, not even a village, where you could see the electricity pylons marching across the fields, but not coming to their own homes. And being a small hamlet, obviously is not highest on the list for electrification. So what Boond and other similar groups do is to install solar microgrids, so panels on one person's building, suitable building, and then a DC supply to any customers there. And this is a pay-as-you-go system. So somebody explained it to me there, we're talking here about people who may not be able to afford 300 rupees a month, but they might be able to afford 10 rupees a day, which, when you think about it, seems a bit odd, but of course it makes sense. These are folks who don't necessarily have much in the way of savings and are not in a position to plan, ahead for larger expenditures all the time. So the pay-as-you-go system enables people to basically purchase a certain amount of electricity, and it goes onto a little, like a USB connector, fits into their system in their house, and then that does all the billing. The system's monitored from down in Bangalore and make sure there are no faults. I thought it was a really interesting setup because it's providing admittedly fairly small amounts of power, but reliable power at a known cost when people need it. Because I guess the problem still in many places, particularly in the rural areas, is that even though they maybe have an electrical connection, many of the households may not be hooked up, or indeed they may have a connection, but power cuts may mean that they don't get power perhaps in the early evening at times where they really need it. So that's a really ingenious solution. I think we're going to probably see a lot more of that in those areas where it's extremely costly and logistically difficult to get power out from the grid.
Right. But how about the affordability of something like this? Like how expensive or how affordable are these?
Yeah. Well, as you're probably aware, there are many places in the country where states have elected to subsidize electricity to rural areas and rural communities and farmers heavily. So it's more expensive, but the difference is that it's reliable. So when I'm speaking through my hosts to a couple of customers in this particular place, that's what they expressed. They said, we know we're going to get it when we need it. So it's actually very valuable to them. And they can also choose when they want to buy electricity. So there's a degree of control over it, I think, which they found pretty positive.
Yeah, and quite flexible also that way, right? So I think that's a big plus. So I think that's a great way to start off the journey also in one way, that you got to experience some of this in the little hamlets, like you said, right? Not just the bigger cities, but also in these little hamlets, which needed a lot more than, say, some of the city folks, for that matter. And then after this little trip to Unnao, did you head back to Delhi after?
Yes, just briefly, and then I took the Rajdhani to Ahmedabad. So I did have a visit or two lined up there, but I had a bit of a sort of flu bug sort of thing. So I had to lie low for a couple of days, and then I spent the rest of my time there really looking around the old city.
Okay.
And I took the heritage tour, which they walk the walking tour
Okay.
Sure.
of the old town, which was quite fascinating, going through some of the poles, starting at a Hindu temple, ending up at a mosque, and going also via one of the Sikh temples as well.
Yeah,
It's a
I did
wonderful
this. I
tour.
did this. I think what is it? 3 months ago. So it's the Swaminarayan temple to the Jama Masjid, the Juma Masjid Mosque, right? That's the one. Yeah, I think it's
Yes,
brilliant,
yes,
and
yes.
it's great that you got to have a look at this, right? Because Ahmedabad in itself, like recently declared as a heritage city, also UNESCO certified heritage city as well, and it's really great that the way in which these poles or these little neighborhoods, as you mentioned, are set up, and a lot of them have history that dates back to, I think, a few hundred years, right? 400, 500 years. So I think it was really great. The only complaint I had was my groups, or I don't know if it's usually like this, my groups I seem to be way too big. It was more than 30 people, I think, or perhaps 40 or 50 people. Was that the case
Yes.
in your case also?
It was, I can't recall the exact number, but probably a little bit less than that. But yes, I can understand that. That's the price of popularity, I guess.
Yeah, but very cheap. And I think it was great, about 2.5, 3 hours. But we had a really good time. And as you mentioned, right, it takes you from a Hindu temple to a mosque at the end. So it kind of gives you a view of the secular fabric in India also, like how diverse we are that way.
Absolutely.
And a Jain temple, a Sikh temple on road as well.
That's right. And some of the architecture is most interesting. And from a point of view of energy and environmental issues, one of the things I found really fascinating there was the design of some of the old buildings. In fact, the Haveli building in which the bed and breakfast was, where I stayed, was a particularly good example of this. Big underground water tank, major water harvesting, and the design of the interior courtyard is really helps with ventilation and when the sun is really beating down. So the people from previous generations learned quite a few smart things about how to design buildings in a way that harvests resources carefully and allows people to lead relatively comfortable lives. And I think there's an awful lot of lessons we could learn from some of our forebears from previous generations on those issues.
So that's wonderful. And any other places that you stopped by while in Ahmedabad?
I went to the Gandhi's ashram on the north side of the river, which
the
was
Sabarmati
a
ashram.
terrific experience. Yes. And so, as I said, I was a little bit unwell, so I didn't venture too much further than that, but I really enjoyed it. And it's a very busy city. I found it a little bit challenging walking around some of the streets, to be honest. It seemed to be really, really hectic in the old town there, but nonetheless, fascinating place. I'd love to go back.
You should definitely come back. And what was planned after Ahmedabad? Like, did you move? You said Mumbai next?
Yes, went down to Mumbai, and that was rather interesting, actually, because when I got to the station for the train and found my allotted spot on the platform and looked at the passenger list pasted on the outside of the carriage, I happened to have a PhD, so I was down there as Dr. Worringham, and I noticed they had an asterisk saying medical doctor. So I'm really pleased nobody had a heart attack on that train, because if I'd been called up to help them, they may not have made it, and I might be facing a lawsuit. So that's just as well.
Yeah, I think
so. Anyway, took the train down to Mumbai.
Yeah. It's just some of the quirks that you'll come across in India. I think people just assume you're a medical doctor if you have that.
Yeah, and fair enough. But anyway, so I got down to Mumbai, but I found that they had booked me through to, I can't recall the name of the station now, but on the very, very far east of the metropolitan area. My hotel was over in the west, so I decided to disembark before we got into Mumbai and take one of the locals, and that was a bit of a lesson for me in the local train setup. Put it this way, I was compressed against the side of the carriage for a good half hour. I'm impressed by Mumbaikar commuters. I don't know how they do it, but it's a pretty amazing experience being on those trains.
Yeah, a completely different experience. Say the metro, for example, right? But I should say you've been
absolutely.
Yeah. I should say you've been very adventurous there by hopping on into a Mumbai local right after you've landed.
Well, you can't not do it, can you? Can you visit Mumbai and not do that? If you're a bit of a train buff, you have to.
Awesome. So what was lined up in Mumbai? Tell us.
Oh, well, there I met a couple of folks. Debbie Goenka, who's this environmentalist I
Right.
mentioned, who's a wonderful man and fighting lots of very important, I think, environmental battles,
Sure.
really, about the way in which development unfolds in that city. And very accomplished guy, and he had some good thoughts for me. And also I met a gentleman at IIT Mumbai, Professor Rangan Banerjee, who was very knowledgeable about India's whole electricity system. So he certainly upped my knowledge quite a bit there and gave me a few pointers of things to look for. And he actually subsequently visited us here in Australia. He was down in the India-Australia Institute at the University of Melbourne and gave a talk down there a little while ago. So it was good to see him again. And so Mumbai was a fairly short trip. Then I went on to Pune and met a few folks there. One in particular, a very interesting group of food company that has a model farm and processing center where they're using now really as a teaching farm for their contractors, because they discovered that they could actually become far more profitable basically by sound environmental practices, by water harvesting, by making sure that there was clean water supply for the crops, and I think by doing a lot of very sensible and good forward-thinking plans, really, about how to assist people who would otherwise be at the mercy, really, of the local market, plug into a system that has some quite progressive ideas about how to get produce to market in a way that benefits everyone along the chain.
Yeah,
So that was
and I think
interesting.
this is a very, I think, very important bit of the ecosystem also, right? You can't really rely just on the government-funded or the government-subsidized plans to for your energy needs, right? These other individual, independent and much smaller players, they are the ones who come up with innovations. So I think these are really critical in kind of solving this whole energy puzzle that we have in one way also, right?
No, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, everyone's got a part to play. Obviously, governments have a part to play, and that's really crucial to sort of set the framework, set the policies, and take on the tasks that it's not possible for anybody else to do. But I think some of these social enterprises are pretty forward-thinking, and they have the freedom to perhaps explore and experiment a bit with some different solutions. So those are we can learn a great deal from the ones that are more successful, for sure. So then from Pune, it was on to Hyderabad, which I really enjoyed. My visit there was to an energy efficiency expert, Rajkiran Pilulekar at the Indian Staff College, and he's done a lot of very thoughtful work on how India can basically build the new cities, the new buildings, commercial and residential, in a way that doesn't squander energy more than it needs to. So he's been very instrumental in some of the new building standards and energy efficiency standards for buildings, which is not a very glamorous area, to tell you the truth, but it's really important because it makes a fantastic difference to the requirement for generating energy. If you can do it, get your new buildings, and as he pointed out, something like 40% of all of India's buildings by mid-century have yet to be built. So there's an opportunity to do it really smartly, and let's hope that does happen. So Hyderabad was great.
Yeah, and what time of the year did you visit here?
This was November.
Charles? November. Okay, so I think relatively good weather conditions, right? Otherwise, Hyderabad usually tends to get a little hot, but yeah, November should have been okay, I guess.
Yes, it was actually very, very comfortable. I went out also I did a little bit of tourism there. I went to the Golconda Fort, which is a pretty mighty and impressive edifice over on the west side of the city there. That was quite fascinating to see that.
And what about the Hyderabadi biryani? Did you get to sample that?
Do you know, I was a little bit naive. I hadn't quite cottoned on to that being the local dish.
Okay.
So I was probably a bit too obsessed with the purpose of my trip and didn't experience everything I could have done there.
Okay.
Yet another reason to come back, I would say, Saif.
Definitely. I think a very strong reason for you to come back and come back with your wife also, right? So,
Yeah, indeed.
yeah, I think these are some of the things that you can definitely pick up. And so after Hyderabad, did you head off to Bangalore then?
Yes, so down to Bangalore, and I had a lot of fascinating visits there and spoke to some really terrific people. I think amongst them I would have to name Dr. Harish Hande as a really wonderful person, a real humanitarian. He's an Indian who got his training in basically solar engineering in the very early days of that that sort of development, that area, technical area, in Massachusetts, I believe, and came back to India, and he set up the Selco Foundation, and they do a lot of this work where they're also putting in solar plants in places which don't otherwise have access to electricity. And one of the things he said that I found really interesting, and their foundation works on, is trying to make sure that communities, particularly rural communities, it's no good just giving people enough power for mobile phone recharging and a couple of lamps, although that's helpful, and a fan. You've really got to help the community's economic prospects. So if there are ways in which the local agricultural challenges, for example, can be assisted by providing the right kind of know-how and the right kind of technical equipment and so forth, that's really important. So he places a big emphasis in his group on ensuring that the staff who works with him go out and try to solve problems, not to just give people a product or a service, but tries to actually solve their specific local problems. That's pretty impressive. But I also saw a few other folks there. Dr. T.V. Ramachandran at where is he based? Is that the Indian Institute of Science?
IISc, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he works a lot on environmental and energy issues, and particularly he's looking at some of the issues related to hydro up in the Western Ghats and diverting some of the power from that across to Bangalore. And I think his view is that Bangalore, unless it takes its water challenges really, really seriously and very quickly, it could be facing some enormous difficulties much more rapidly than anyone might expect. So he was had a strong cautionary note for how we develop these cities.
Yeah, I think I can definitely, as a local, right? So both Faz and I for Bangalore also, we can definitely vouch for given the way in which the city has expanded also, right? And there's been a lot of migration from different parts of India to Bangalore as well. So that way, the city has expanded like crazy, and even not just electricity-wise, not just the hydropower-wise, even just in general terms of the water bodies, right? I think we used to have like 200 odd lakes back in the day, and now we're just left to a handful. So we're losing a lot of them, and unless we take some concrete steps, I think it's we have to do something. Otherwise, I think the end's not far in terms of how these resources go down the drain. So I think that's
quite right. Yes, and indeed, in case of water, obviously a lot of the coal-fired power stations in India use fresh water from the river systems for cooling. And there have been a number of instances over the last couple of years where they've had to shut down plants because of a shortage of water or competition with water for, with other users, irrigators, and people for just drinking water. So that's one reason, I think, amongst many, why India would be really wise to keep up with its strong push to transition to clean energy, because it's not just about energy. It's also about the basic resources of clean water and clean air. And goodness me, the last few weeks in Delhi, I think people can appreciate the significance of cleaning up the air.
Yeah, you probably have seen a bit of it firsthand, right, being in Delhi. I think it's just also, given that we are such a big and growing population, I think that's also a big reason that we have to clean up our act. Because if you have... If it was a much smaller country, maybe we could have gotten away with it by finding things, just getting around it. But now with this big of a population, we have to do something concrete. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard for the future generations that are coming up, right? Yeah, so some real challenges that we're looking at. But I think in one way we're taking the right steps. It's just that the way they're implemented, because even in terms of solar energy, right, that's something that the current government is focusing on quite a bit. So they have, I think, a set target of, I can't quite remember, 100 gigawatts of...
total of 175 of wind and solar by 2022. 175 gigawatts, which would be a huge and ambitious target. And even if India doesn't quite make it, it's making enormous strides towards it. And I think it has, the really fascinating thing to me is that India has an opportunity, if it gets this right, to really, really set an example to the rest of the world. And a practical example, methods that can be adopted and picked up elsewhere. And that's a very rare thing that happens, that kind of opportunity. So if India gets it wrong, we're all in trouble. because if it goes down the road of much increased coal consumption for energy, it's not just India that will suffer. Our global warming situation will simply get worse. So these things are important, but they're also, you have to be positive about it. There's great opportunities and terrific work being done. At a much more local scale, by the way, when I was in Bangalore, I got the chance to visit a group called Pollinate Energy, which is another social enterprise. It's actually Australian founded, and they work with rural migrant communities. So in the sort of squatter camps where people come in from the surrounding areas, perhaps during a very hot, dry spell when it's difficult to make ends meet out in some other parts of the state, for construction work and other kinds of work. And often one of their problems is there's no energy supply for them. So Pollinate sets them up with solar lanterns and clean cook stoves and basic things that help them help their time in the city, because usually people will be there for a few months and then go back. But really assists them in their energy needs, which otherwise may go unmet, actually. So that was pretty
interesting.
fascinating.
And you got a local connection also, right? Australian connection?
Yes, that's right. Well, Pollinate Energy was actually, this is a funny thing, it was actually founded, and I had no idea, by a former student of mine at university. And I only learned that when I got back to Australia. So, yeah, there is a bit of a connection there.
Funny coincidence. Yeah. Awesome. So was this like inching closer to the end of your trip? Like how long has it been?
Yes, yes.
How many in terms of days?
That took me to about three weeks or so. So I then headed down to Kochi, and as I said earlier, I just took the plane down there because that was my last few days, and I became just a real tourist again. Basically, there was no visits. I could please myself. Went out to Fort Kochi and looked at some of the history of that very interesting area. Met a chap who drives an auto rickshaw around Fort Kochi mostly for the foreign visitors, and I couldn't figure out, on the front of his rickshaw he had the town of Newcastle in Australia, in the state of New South Wales, and some slogan about Newcastle. I said, what's that all about? And he said, a couple of Aussies visited a couple of years ago, and they loved his rickshaw so much they bought it from him and wanted to take it back to Australia. But the Australian government wouldn't allow them to use it there. It wouldn't pass their roadworthiness test or something. so they had to leave it in Kochi. So that was kind of fun. But no, it's a fascinating place, and the history is obviously quite different and quite distinct from other towns that I'd visited there. And I enjoyed that very much as a way to end up the trip and let my hair down and just look around a little bit more.
Absolutely. And wonderful. So did you fly back right from here, or did you have to head back to Delhi to return to Australia?
No, I flew back from Kochi and digested some of the information I had, and I did have the opportunity to come back this last February to the World Sustainable Development Summit in Delhi, and also an Energy Access Summit, just for a short stay. And I'm going to be back actually next month for one of those meetings, and then my son is going to join me, and we're going to do another train trip. We're going to head east, actually, head towards the Eastern Ghat Mountains.
Okay.
And have a little look around there. So I promised my son that we should do one fairly serious trip together while we have the opportunity, and that's the one we've chosen.
That's brilliant, and we're glad that you've chosen India. So I was actually going to ask you, what are the impressions India has left on you, and it seems like it's good impressions, and given that you've come back a couple of times since, and now you're planning to come back with your son again. So I think it's really, really heartwarming to hear that.
Well, it is just a fascinating place. It's not an easy country for everyone to travel in. Sure. I think some of the logistical obstacles are quite real in some respects, and there are some things I shouldn't pretend. There are some sites and some things that are a little confronting to people who've not experienced them before. But I think we live in a very genuinely interconnected world. Lots of people in India, your age particularly, do have the opportunity now to see more of the world, and for those of us who have had the sort of fortune to live in very affluent, very wealthy parts of the world, it's incredibly important, I think, that we understand some of the challenges which other places have, and see what ways we can think of to play our small part in making sure we're all in a better place down the track.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Charles. It's been really wonderful listening to your story and for enlightening all of us and maybe showing us a different perspective about how we can look at our lives and travel also. So thank you so much. And I just had one question to ask with respect to a traveler. You have been traveling on a mission to understand how energy and a sustained living is happening. So any tips for a traveler?
Well, I suppose the one experience I have had is that, I mean, people travel for many different reasons, don't they? I mean, all of us travel for different reasons. Sometimes it's purely for pleasure. Sometimes it's because we have a particular activity we want to do, like adventure tourism or traveling for sport. People go around the world for running or whatever else it might be. So I think all those different reasons why people travel are completely valid, and no one type is better than any other. But the one thing I experienced, I think, about this trip, and maybe it's if I can pull rank with age and say that, when you've been knocking around on the planet for a bit and you've learned a few things, it's a little bit easier, I think, to develop an idea for travel that has some sort of purpose in mind, some kind of understanding in mind. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be history, language, culture, any aspect of it. So it doesn't have to be something as arcane as energy that I was interested in. But I think if you go to a place with a purpose, your experience of that place is quite simply deeper and more valuable.
Right.
I think that's a brilliant thought, and thank you so much for enlightening all of us and giving us a great perspective also of things and how one can look at things and travel in general, right? So thank you so much. And just before closing this off, I just wanted to pick on you a little bit about whether you got a chance to watch the latest Australia-India cricket series.
How dare you bring that up? Actually, no, I was very well aware of the results. Congratulations, India. Brilliant games, brilliant play. Got some great players there. I have a small connection there because I had a colleague at work whose young son just became an Australian cricketer fairly recently. Young Matt Renshaw, one of the batsmen. In fact, he came over to India in 2017, I think, on the tour there. Sure. Didn't stand out, but it was lovely to see somebody you knew make it onto the team there. So, yeah, I found that actually was a fantastic way to start conversations with folks in taxis and Ubers.
Sure. Because,
cricket.
Yeah.
That is a connection that we surely have between our countries.
Yeah, I think that clearly surpasses boundaries and cultures, and it's the big unifier, right? As they say, and I had to rub it in a little bit because it was the first time I think an away team has won a series, Australia, right? So I'm sorry, no offense.
Yeah, absolutely, no, a bit of history, cricket history there.
Wonderful. So I'd just like to wrap this up, Charles, by saying that thank you so much. First of all, we are delighted that we had this opportunity to host you and talk to you about this trip, and we are even more happy that you really liked your time in India, experiences that you enjoyed here, and you're coming back, and if possible we should keep in touch and we should definitely catch up when you're here next time. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saif, and thank you, Faiza.
That was yet another great episode of the Musafir Stories. If you guys like the show, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Audioboom, Savan, Pocket Casts, Castbox, Stitcher, or any other podcasting app available on iOS or Android. Please do leave us a review on iTunes. It goes a long way in the show's discoverability. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We go by the handle The Musafir Stories. Or, if it suits you, you could email us at themusafirstories@gmail.com or visit our website at www.themusafirstories.com for more information. All of these links will be made available in the show notes section of each episode. So here's to more traveling, sharing, and inspiring. Stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, happy travels and goodbye.